Welcome back to part 2 of a special interview with Congress Rajya Sabha MP and former Minister Jairam Ramesh for The Wire. In part 1, I spoke to him about the Congress party, the challenges and problems it faces. But now, in part 2, in a complete change of subject, I'm going to talk to Jairam Ramesh about his forthcoming biography of V K Krishna Menon, India's former and some would say most controversial former defense minister. And here is the book. It's 720 pages long and it's called A Checkered Brilliance, The Many Lives of V K Krishna Menon. The book will be launched on Wednesday the 18th, and let me tell you, my hunch is it's going to make an enormous impact. Today, I want to raise some of the critical aspects of that book with its author, Jairam Ramesh. Jairam, as I read your book, the picture that was formed of Krishna Menon in my mind was of a man who was complex, but also very difficult to understand, contradictory but clever, intense and intellectual, but also impetuous and very, very insecure. Now, you're his biographer, you've researched him and studied him. To what extent is that image correct?
All of the above, Karan. Each of the words you have used, the C's and the I's, apply to this man. He was a consequential personality, very compelling, but very contradictory and very controversial. And most importantly, of course, he left behind a humongous archive, which has been lying closed in the Nehru Memorial Library, which was opened up for scrutiny only in February of this year. And this biography really is based on the archive that he left behind of his very, very colorful many lives. You know, he had many avatars in the 20th century. And we remember him, of course, only for 1962. But there is more to Krishna Menon than 1962.
But the interesting thing from what you're saying is that your access to his archives and the fact that he's left documents aplenty, in a sense means that he's speaking for himself through your book.
Absolutely. He's left behind for posterity. I don't know why he maintained every ticket, every slip of paper, every note that he wrote.
Perhaps he had an eye on history.
He had an eye on his history, absolutely. People like Gandhi, people like Nehru, people like Krishna Menon, people like Huxley, who have left behind humongous archives, had an eye on history, and they expected somebody would come and excavate these archives.
So he was actually hoping that someone like you would come and do this mammoth book.
Well, there have been biographers in the past, but none of them have had access to the primary material. And so this is, I must say,
this is what makes your book unique.
I think so. Karan, I must say that, you know, for me, the job of a biographer is not to assert. The job of a biographer is to ascertain. So I've written a biography of Indira Gandhi as an environmentalist. I've written a biography of P.N. Huxley, the great civil servant, and now Krishna Menon. It's not judgmental. It's narrative. And is a narrative.
You're making available facts. Let others form their opinion.
Let them feel. There is enough of this material in this book to condemn Krishna Menon. There is enough in this book to glorify him. But my job is neither to deify or vilify. My job is to present, as a biographer, the material that is available in the archives and let the reader make up his or her mind.
Now, a moment ago you said quite correctly that to most people, Krishna Menon is known only as a controversial defense minister
Absolutely.
who was in power in 1962 when India lost the India-China war. But he was also a man who had an outstanding career at the United Nations, where his speeches in defense of the Indian position on Kashmir actually attracted international acclaim. And he was highly regarded by people like Dean Acheson, Anthony Eden, Lester Pearson, R.G. Casey. Tell me a bit about this side of Krishna Menon, because this is where he became an internationally known man.
Absolutely, Karan. But from 1952 to 1957, he was known as Formula Menon. Wherever there was a problem, Korea, Krishna Menon. Suez, Krishna Menon. Algeria, Krishna Menon. Cyprus, Krishna Menon. He was known as Formula Menon. And in 1955, Krishna Menon almost pulled off the biggest coup, which Kissinger then subsequently pulled off in 1971. And Kissinger became, firmly, ensconced himself in history.
Opening
Krishna
the door
Menon,
between China and America.
In 1955, he has 8 days of meetings with Chow and Lai. And then he goes and meets Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles and Richard Nixon. But, the environment was different at that time. So you're right. That part of Krishna Menon, when he was really the darling of the international diplomatic set. That period lasted from 52 to 57. That was a great period when Krishna Menon became India's second most well-known public figure, next only to Nehru.
You're absolutely true, but something else is also true, that India has never had since then a man who has straddled the international stage as such a colossus.
Absolutely. He was both detested and liked. He had a legion of admirers, and I've quoted in the book letters that he would get from ordinary Americans, ordinary Britishers. But the establishment in both these countries hated him. They despised him. And I believe they despised him because here was this third world man standing up in a world dominated by the whites. And here was a darky in every respect, getting up and telling them what to do, lecturing them on colonialism. On South Africa, Karan, he was one of the earliest to keep fighting for decolonization. On disarmament, he was one of the first guys to talk about disarmament. So there were many issues on the international stage, and since Krishna Menon, we have not had a figure of that caliber striding the international diplomatic stage, as it were.
Now, to us in India, he's best known as the man who was defense minister for 5.5 years from 57 till 62. What people know of that period is his handling of relations with China and the war. What people seem to have forgotten is that he was also the man who created the Defense Research and Development Organization and several defense production units. Would I be right in saying that perhaps in a very real sense, he's the architect of India's defense production?
Absolutely, absolutely. India had some indifferent defense ministers, Sardar Baldev Singh, Gopal Semi Iyengar, K.N. Kajju. Nehru himself was defense minister for 2 years. Krishna Menon was India's first full-time defense minister, active, hyperactive. He created research organizations, created this defense production establishment. The MiG aircraft, India's entry, Make in India, which we attribute to Mr. Narendra Modi. He negotiated the MiG aircraft on the condition that those MiGs would be made in India. And the Americans and the Brits never forgave him for that, because the Russians accepted the condition that those MiGs should be manufactured in India. The Americans and the Brits didn't. So to that end, he was a real visionary, self-reliance, self-sufficiency in defense research and defense establishment. On China, you mentioned China, Karan. There's no doubt about it that, he weakened the morale in the army. He played favorites. He hounded Thimayya and Thorat. And he created an environment of distrust in the army. However, what people forget, that Krishna Menon was the only person in India arguing for a negotiated settlement with China on the border issue. From 54 onwards, he is arguing for a negotiated settlement.
And if I understand correctly, he was happy to give over claims to Aksai Chin in return
for the Chimbi Valley. For the Chimbi Valley,
yeah.
He was doing a lease. There was it was a swap agreement. Now it's interesting, Karan. I have always wondered why Nehru didn't assert himself and go for this negotiated settlement.
Now what's your answer?
And my argument in the book is that by 58, 59, Nehru was in his period of decline. It was the autumn of the patriarch, so to speak. And by then, Govind Vallabh Pant, Morarji Desai, S.K. Patil, that so-called, what we call the right-wing lobby in the cabinet
was
much stronger than the Krishna Menon, K.D. Malviya type of a lobby which represented the left. Parliament was not in favor of a negotiated settlement. People like Atal Bihari Vajpayee, a first-term MP, were arguing against it. Ram Manohar Lohia was arguing against it. Acharya Kripalani was arguing. Nobody wanted a negotiated settlement on the border because they believed that this was our territory. But Krishna Menon kept insisting on this. And in 1960, the last chance for a negotiated settlement, in April of 1960, when Chow En Lai comes to India, Krishna Menon is actually kept out of the negotiations because Govind Vallabh Pant insists that Swaran Singh should be part of the negotiations. That negotiations fall apart. It's interesting, Karan. The postscript to this is in 2003, Atal Bihari Vajpayee goes to Beijing and signs an agreement which sets up special representatives on both sides to do what? to work out a negotiated settlement to the border. So many years after Krishna Menon's
Krishna
idea,
Menon was offering a solution to a problem before it even led to war.
Absolutely.
Had he been listened to?
in my view, had he been listened to, and I have quoted in the back cover Indira Gandhi's speech in Parliament where she says, if Krishna Menon had been listened to, we may not have had the war with China.
This is a moment when history could have turned but didn't.
It would have, it couldn't have. But you know, the environment, Karan, Parliament, media, Nehru's own cabinet, everybody,
And
the socialists.
and Nehru in decline.
And Nehru in decline. Nehru was in decline. Nehru was not, I mean, there is no greater Nehruite than me. But I have to say that after 1958, it was the autumn of the patriarch.
Now, there's another aspect of Krishna Menon that comes out strikingly, if not dramatically, in your book. He must have written countless letters to Nehru
Oh,
from New York and often from Delhi, frequently from London, each of which expressed his personal insecurity, each of which was a plea for reassurance that he was wanted and valued, and frequently he would either offer or threaten to resign. And as I read this, and it's there all the time, it keeps happening, I said to myself, and I'm using colloquial language, there's a part of him that's unbalanced, that's unhinged.
Yes.
He's a split personality.
Yes,
He's
yes.
not just troubled, he's much more. Would you agree?
absolutely. I mean, I've refrained from doing psychohistory in this biography. But anybody who looks at these letters would come to this conclusion that here was a schizophrenic, here was somebody who was deeply troubled, who had demons within him, and he was trying to exorcise these demons through his letters. You know, he wrote hundreds of letters from 1935 to 1960, and next only to Gandhi and Indira Gandhi, I think Nehru had this maximum correspondence with Krishna Menon. But the type of correspondence that he had with Krishna Menon was unique. I mean, Nehru was bearing his soul to Krishna Menon. Krishna Menon was bearing his soul to Nehru, and that's why I've called them soulmates. They really were soulmates.
In fact, you also say in your book that there was perhaps no other person who was intellectually on the same wavelength and so close to Nehru
absolutely.
as Krishna Menon.
See, Krishna Menon was, I've described him, and not I, but his British admirers described him as a good Britisher, but a true Indian. And in many ways, Nehru was that too. Nehru, as you know, once told Mountbatten that he was the last viceroy. He, not Mountbatten, was the last Englishman to rule India. So both of them were very British in their reasoning, in their love for debate, love for institutions, love for reason, the role of
Krishna
reason
Menon
in
was
public
a great
life.
Anglophile.
And he was both were Anglophiles. Both were Anglophiles. Both were deeply suspicious of the United States. Both were.
But Krishna Menon, on
both
the
were-
issue of the Commonwealth, actually played a lead role and found the formula that ensured that India could continue.
And both were. I wouldn't say both were leftists, but both were centre left. And both were enamored of the Soviet Union, notwithstanding the atrocities of Stalin.
Now, many people in the army look back on Krishna Menon and say he was a bad defense
Absolutely.
minister and he poorly advised and often misled the prime minister. As his biographer, is that a fair or an unfair
No, it's
opinion?
not exaggerated. It is fair. The relationship between him and Thimayya was uneasy. It was uneasy because Thimayya became a larger-than-life personality. Remember, there was a book on Thimayya that came out entitled Thimayya of India by Humphrey Evans. This is almost like Montgomery of El Alamein. And Thimayya became a world figure in Korea in 1953-54. And Thimayya was a charismatic man. He was a charismatic general. And I think Krishna Menon always had somewhere in his mind an impression that Thimayya had this larger-than-life personality, might try to attempt taking power in India, and particularly after 1958, the coup that happens in Pakistan. That's why you see after 1958, Krishna Menon keeps on talking of how the civilians are always supreme, there will never be any military rule in India, there's no possibility of a coup in India, and the political establishment will always be one step ahead of the military leadership. But there is no doubt that his relationship with Thimayya, which was exceedingly warm to begin with in 57, 58, deteriorated, and 59.
I'll come to Thimayya in a moment's time. But as his biographer, what is your overall judgment or assessment of the man? Not just Defence Minister, but of the man and his career.
Well, I think I'm absolutely amazed that Nehru gave him such a long rope. In the face of the evidence of of the damage that he was you could almost describe what was said of John Foster Dulles could be said of Krishna Menon, that he was a bull who carried his own China with him, and he did destabilize the army in the 59 to 61 period. He overlooked Thorat as a successor to Thimayya. He played favourites. B.M. Kaul was a favourite of Nehru, but became a greater favourite of Krishna Menon. And B.M. Kaul's role in 1962, very, very questionable. And the fact is that when I look at his stewardship of the Defence Ministry, I came to the conclusion that this man was not suited to be Defence Minister.
He was the wrong choice.
He was the wrong choice.
He should never have been made.
He would have been great. I've said so. He would have been great as a planning minister. He would have been great as an education minister. But with the benefit of hindsight,
Possibly foreign minister?
possibly foreign minister. But I'm amazed that as defense minister, he would spend 4 months in a year
because of
at the United
his
Nations.
deep interest.
Because
in
he was
the
a
United-
special envoy
Quite
to
right.
the UN as well.
So what's your overall judgment then of the man?
My overall judgment is of a man is extraordinarily gifted, very, very intellectual, exceedingly well read. After all, he founded Pelican Books. He was one of the pillars of Penguin, which has published my book, and he founded Pelican Books. Exceedingly well read, and very charismatic figure, very attractive to women. He liked women more than men, certainly, that's for sure. The only man he had time for was perhaps Nehru, and a few others in Britain, particularly Lasky.
Mountbatten.
Mountbatten and Lasky were great favourites of his. But there were so many dimensions of the man. He was a theosophist, Karan. He was a protege. His first mentor was Annie Besant. So he had multiple roles, multiple avatars.
I want now to focus on two things in your book that are not necessarily central to the biography, but for the first time you're revealing or confirming things that people haven't known about. And they're to do about two former army chiefs. And I think of them as astonishing revelations. First, General Thimayya. Your book reveals that in 1959, when he resigned and then virtually 48 hours later took his resignation back, he also had extensive discussions with the British High Commissioner of the time, Malcolm MacDonald, who also, by the way, happened to be his next door neighbour, where he in fair detail revealed to the British High Commissioner the extent of his problems and disillusionment with the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. And as I read this, I said to myself, this is not just an army chief being indiscreet. He's behaving utterly improperly and wrongly.
I am shocked. I was shocked when I read the transcripts of the interviews between Thimayya and Malcolm MacDonald. They are available at the University of Durham in the UK. And when I saw it, my eyes popped out. I can't believe that an Indian Army chief, serving Indian Army chief, is talking to a British High Commissioner about his own bosses in the manner. He was not critical of Nehru, by the way, but the way he was talking of Krishna Menon and other personalities, just absolutely shocking to me. And of course, we had this resignation episode, and the news of the resignation episode was leaked to the Statesman by one of Thimayya's senior most colleagues,
who went on to become
who
chief
went on
himself.
to become the army chief,
General Chaudhry.
in November 1962.
But
General Chaudhry.
let's take the two instances separately, because that's the second chief's revelations I want to talk about. Let's stick to Thimayya for a moment. One of the things you say about Thimayya is that you write that Thimayya told the British High Commissioner that Krishna Menon as Defence Minister, and I'm quoting you now, was perhaps trying deliberately to make himself the master of the armed forces so that he might one day have their support in the achievement of his political ambition to take Mr. Nehru's place either after or even before Mr. Nehru's withdrawal from public life. And those are the words with which Malcolm MacDonald communicated what Thimayya had said.
These are not my words, these are Malcolm MacDonald's words. Yeah.
And this means that a serving army chief had told the British High Commissioner, A, that his defense minister had Bonapartist ambitions and
Absolutely.
B, could be in some sort of political coup to displace the prime minister.
Absolutely. And, it's very interesting. Simultaneously, I also quote Khera, who was defense secretary for a while. In his book, of course, that came much after the event, he writes of the deep suspicion which the political class had of a possible coup by Thimayya. So the military men were thinking that Krishna Menon was going to stage a coup, and Krishna Menon was thinking that the military men were interested in staging a coup. This is an incredible situation.
Absolutely. But the funny thing, and it's not even funny, it's a deeply disturbing thing, is that a serving army chief unburdened his soul
find it
to a
inexcusable.
British High Commissioner.
Inexcusable. And I asked Shankar Bajpai, the only person I consulted was Shankar Bajpai on this, because Shankar Bajpai knew all the personalities, and I asked him, I said, sir, what do you make of this? And Shankar Bajpai looked at me and smiled and he said, Jairam, whiskey.
But that's even worse.
Whiskey.
If a whiskey can make an army chief speak so
whiskey.
openly to
Whiskey.
a high commissioner, then that is really a major problem.
I mean, the record of Thimayya's meeting with had Menon known about this, had Krishna Menon
It was
known about
sackable.
this, it was something that is simply not done by a serving army chief.
A moment ago you used the word inexcusable. But in your book, if I'm correct, you simply called it highly unusual. And
Yeah.
at another point you say it calls into judgment or to question the general's judgment. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Thimayya. I've been to his house in Coorg. I read everything about him. I know
Is that
some
why you
members of
haven't
his
been
family.
stronger in the book?
No,
But
but
you don't say inexcusable in the book.
Yeah, I don't say inexcusable, but it is. I mean, in a way, I've almost said inexcusable without using the word.
You said highly
inexcusable.
unusual.
It's highly unusual.
But highly unusual is a euphemism.
It is. I mean, maybe I'm guilty of a euphemism there. Maybe I should have used the word inexcusable.
You're guilty of something slightly worse, of whitewashing it.
No, I should have used the word inexcusable. I should have used the word.
Let me put something else to you. I mentioned last night this story about Thimayya and Malcolm MacDonald to a serving Indian MP, and the answer I got was, this sounds vaguely like, if not vaguely, even fully like treason. Now, maybe it's not treason, but it is a lot stronger
Yeah.
than highly unusual.
It's maybe I should have used the word inexcusable. Maybe I was a bit generous to Thimayya, of whom I'm a great admirer, by the way.
Would you also accept something else? That this is the sort of thing one usually encounters in spy novels, or when informants are briefing their handlers. You never think that a serving army chief will be briefing a foreign ambassador to this extent about his government.
Karan, Thimayya was not the only one who was being indiscreet. If you read transcripts of Malcolm MacDonald's meetings with Radhakrishnan, for example, the way Radhakrishnan opens up to Malcolm MacDonald is incredible.
And he was the serving vice president.
He was a serving vice president. The way Radhakrishnan opens up to Chester Bowles, for example. I mean, there is something in the 50s and 60s that gave the American ambassador and the UK High Commissioner a special position in the Indian ruling establishment, and people opened out to them. People would talk to them much more frequently than they would talk to their own colleagues.
So in other words, the mahal, if I can use that word, was such that Indian people at the top of the establishment felt no hesitation in sharing information, secrets or whatever with foreigners, because they felt it wouldn't be held against them. It would be understood.
I have not used the material, the transcripts of meetings that N.R. Pillai, for example, who was the top man in the Ministry of External Affairs.
Secretary General.
Secretary General in the Ministry of External Affairs had with his British and American counterparts. And his impressions of Nehru, his impressions of Menon, his impressions of his colleagues. I have not used any of that material. But that is, I find that extraordinarily odd, that you would open up to foreign diplomats
in this way. The second army chief about whom you have astonishing revelations is in fact General Chaudhry. Now, first of all, you corroborate something that General Chaudhry has in fact himself admitted in his autobiography.
Absolutely.
That from 1951 for 10 years, he was the secret anonymous military correspondent of the Statesman, which was at the time still British owned and British edited.
Ivan Charleston.
Evan Charlton was the editor.
Yeah.
But you go one step further. You actually say in your book you believe General Chaudhary was the person who leaked Thimayya's resignation letter in 1959, which is how it ended up as a banner front page headline in the Statesman. Now that deeply embarrassed the Prime Minister, it embarrassed the Defence Minister, and frankly, it did no great credit to General Thimayya himself. Are you sure General Chaudhary leaked the letter?
100%. 100%. A. Statesman was the only newspaper that had the news, number one. Number two, it's said by our political correspondent. I did a lot of digging and I discovered that General Chaudhary was the military correspondent. Then I contacted, I'm revealing this for the first time, I hope that he will not take it amiss. I called up the editor of the Statesman.
Ravindra Kumar.
Yes. And I said, Mr. Kumar, I found this. What do you make of it? He says, well, it is ancient folklore in Statesman that the military correspondent gave the news to the political correspondent.
In other words, General Chaudhary didn't use it himself,
No.
but gave it to the political correspondent.
And this I confirmed with H.K. Dua as well, who was a contemporary of the political correspondent of that time. And or not a contemporary, but somebody who knew
and
the
was
political,
working on the Statesman too.
who was working in the Statesman.
So you have two sources to confirm
Absolutely.
that General Chaudhary
Nothing
was
written.
the leaker.
Nothing written.
But two sources have confirmed that General Chaudhary leaked the news.
The first source is General Chaudhary's own autobiography, which says that he was the military correspondent of the Statesman and he wrote anonymously. And it's extraordinary that the Statesman is the only newspaper to have the news of Thimayya's resignation. Extraordinary.
And now-
the
and
only
now-
conclusion I can draw.
And
is
two people
Chaudhary.
have confirmed the
Yes,
conclusion
absolutely.
that Chaudhary leaked it to the
I
political
am willing to
correspondent.
stick my neck out and get all the criticism, but Chaudhary leaked the news of Thimayya's resignation.
And you're prepared to say you're 100%
I'm
confident.
100% sure.
100%.
100% sure.
So you see the amazing picture that builds up. Here you have not just a senior army general, but you describe him with the words a top army general, who for 10 years has worked secretly and anonymously on a second job as a journalist. And
By the
Chaudhary
way,
in his own book said-
we don't know whether he had the permission. I tried my best.
That's what I'm asking you.
I tried my best to find out. I couldn't find out. We do not know whether, and nowhere in his autobiography does General Chaudhary say that he was writing with the permission of the Prime Minister and the Defence
And
Minister.
one would
Nowhere it says
assume
it.
that the government would not give permission, particularly to a senior general, to moonlight.
Yes. He was moonlighting as by a military correspondent.
A senior top general who went on to become army,
army
chief
chief.
himself was moonlighting.
Went on to become High Commissioner to Canada.
was moonlighting.
Absolutely. From 1951. And this
And
is
this is equally shocking.
but we have his own admission in his autobiography.
Yeah, I know.
His own admission.
Absolutely, I'm not denying it.
Yes.
But this is particularly shocking.
I mean,
It raises questions of morality. It's
well, you know,
immoral
Karan,
and wrong.
Karan, I read that
And
autobiography.
he was, by the way, moonlighting for a British owned paper with a British editor.
I read that biography twice or thrice. I tried contacting General Chaudhary's family. I tried to speak to old timers, go through the records to see whether there is any official permission given to General Chaudhary to write for the Statesman.
If there was, he would have put it in his book.
He would have put it in his book. That was the reasoning I had. If he would have said, Pandit Nehru or whoever it was, the defense minister, gave me permission. He has not said anything of that.
I've read the requisite pages of the book. They happen to be page 205 in particular. And the first thing that struck me is that General Chaudhary was pretty brazen about what he'd done. He had no compunction admitting it. He had no sense of remorse or guilt, no hesitation or embarrassment. And he admitted it as if it was quite acceptable.
And there is a third unusual episode on this, which you have not mentioned. You said there are two unusual
What is the
episodes.
third?
Let me tell you the third. Nehru goes to Parliament and gives a statement on the 2nd of September. Right? He can't do it on the 1st of September because he's busy with Ayub Khan, who is, in Delhi, who's stopping over in Parliament.
He's talking about a statement to do with Thimayya's resignation.
Thimayya's resignation. And he's overflying Delhi. He's going from Karachi to Dhaka. He spends time in Parliament. Nehru is busy with him. So he can't go to Parliament. So he goes to Parliament the next day and gives a statement, on the Thimayya episode. And Thimayya tells Malcolm MacDonald that my statement to Nehru was changed by Krishna Menon. And it was the change statement that was read by Nehru in Parliament. Thimayya tells this to Malcolm MacDonald, and Malcolm MacDonald records this
And sends it to his
and
foreign
sends it
office.
to his bosses in London, and is all there in the records.
And this again is another example,
So
not just of the indiscretion, but what colloquially people would call treason.
No, I
Treason
don't
may
want
be a
to
bit
use,
strong.
I don't want to use the
Yeah.
word treason.
But
I mean,
colloquially people would call it that. But come back, I want to come back to General Chaudhary just for a moment before I end. Not only was General Chaudhary clearly moonlighting, he had a second job when he was a senior general, which the government didn't know about. But, and he was brazen enough to admit it without any sense of remorse or embarrassment, as if this was quite acceptable. But in his own book, he reveals that this happened because he met Evan Charlton at a drinks party in Delhi. Evan Charlton said to him, "Do you know of a good person we can take on as a military correspondent?" hoping that Chaudhary would direct them towards someone.
But
And
Chaudhary offered himself.
himself.
He offered himself, which I found even more hilarious.
I mean, the whole thing is bizarre.
It was a bizarre thing, absolutely. But I would say what Chaudhary did also was unacceptable. And as you say,
Again, sackable.
Sackable. And I came to the conclusion that had he got permission from his higher ups, he would have mentioned it.
Absolutely. So now we've discussed episodes concerning two army chiefs, and you may have a certain fondness for one, Thimayya, but as you agreed, both had done things which, if they had been discovered by their bosses, they would have been rightly, legitimately sacked
absolutely,
for.
Yeah, absolutely. Krishna Menon had every reason to sack Thimayya for the way he was talking to Malcolm MacDonald.
And similarly, if the government had found out that Mutu
That
Chaudhary, General Chaudhary,
both of
was
them had
actually
no business
moonlighting,
being in the army.
He had no
Absolutely.
business being
no
in the army.
business being in the army.
Jairam Ramesh, as I said, this book, and I'm holding it up once again for the audience, is going to create enormous waves. Congratulations on a great piece of work.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.